Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. Bill's going to now kick this episode off with talking about alfalfa and how important it is to specifically the dairy industry, but some other industries as well.
Welcome back to In a Nutshell. Today we're going to talk about another field crop, alfalfa, one of the most prolific and high volume crops grown in the U.S. Not like corn or soybeans, but nonetheless grown in a lot of states, particularly around dairy industry. And one of the things, it's really high protein type of quality forage that's really necessary for really high-end milk production. And so it's in and around a lot of dairy areas, and sometimes even from, say, here in California, we get it from other states. We'll get it in from particularly Nevada or Idaho, and so we'll, it'll be trucked in here because it just is a really essential feed for the ration of dairy cows. There also is some still fed to racehorses. I've seen it fed to horses, but it's since it's got this high protein and a lot of energy, it can be overwhelming to a lot of, so you got to be really careful on horses and their digestion with it. So it has to be the right kind, but there is some in that particular arena.
Now Bill's going to talk about the different aspects and properties of alfalfa.
It's a unique forage crop, one in that it has so many variabilities to it. It has variability in how it performs. There's just tons of different varieties. Some are built in with different disease tolerance. Some of them are built for the weather with what we call dormancy, and where we fit those for the type of weather we're having. One, it's cut multiple times throughout the year. Some places it might only get cut twice a year to 3 times a year. Other places it can be cut 8, 9, even 10 times. So you think about that, it's almost every month throughout the year. And it just depends on weather, location, varietal influences, and the type of soil and water that you may have. It's very tolerant to drought. Like if you run out of water and quit irrigating it, you get through that rest of the summer and get back into the next year. It's deep-rooted, particularly if it's well-established in its second year and beyond. So just a very, very versatile crop. And one thing that makes it has its versatility is that it's a legume, basically. And what's that? It's a plant that will supply and fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and basically so it becomes less expensive. I mean, it needs some nitrogen, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But also it will give you a storage unit, the nodules that form on the roots that are of this legume, and there's bean crops that do the same thing, but we're going to talk mostly about alfalfa here, how those nodules will form, and in those will be a storage unit for nitrogen that it can use later. And what it produces that it doesn't use, it's going to be available to the next crop that's grown behind it. So it's necessary sometimes, and one thing about forming these nodules and being a legume is it's a certain amount, a certain type, a couple different ones, but primarily one for sure, that is a nitrogen-fixing bacteria that's inherent in your soil. And so if you plant your alfalfa seed and get it going and get it established, that bacteria will then work on taking excess nitrogen through the plant, fixing it and putting it into nodules and down in the roots. There's other crops, clover does it, and bean crops will do it. And so you can actually dig those up, and you'll see a lot of times there'll be little pink spots on it as it starts to form nodulation. This is really important to understand, because if you have it and you go out and you develop what I call a true virgin field that's never had anything growing on it ever before, there is a possibility that it doesn't have this specific nitrogen fixing bacteria, which means your legume will fail. Particularly the alfalfa, you'll have a lot of expense establishing it, getting your field ready, seeding it, getting it irrigated, and then it doesn't really do anything because it doesn't have this particular bacteria. And so you can buy an inoculant and mix it in with your alfalfa seed. And then once you've applied it, then it will develop into the field, and bacteria and a lot of soil microbes grow rapidly. So it'll be a one-time fix, and you'll never have to do it again. But if you're going into a virgin field, literally, that's never had a lot of crops in it, that's something you should check for. If not, you have a failure, and alfalfa seed is very expensive, and it takes a lot of money to establish an alfalfa, getting it ready, getting the soil all properly prepared, and then you go in and get your seed planted and get it germinated, and then it just kind of fails for lack of this bacteria. So it's very important that you know whether you have it or you don't have it.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about how nitrogen plays a role with alfalfa.
But since it's a legume, and a lot of people think, well, then if it's a legume, I don't need to put any nitrogen on because it fixes it and it supplies itself with its own nitrogen. Well, it can supply in good, healthy, well-balanced soils with the nutrients that you need to grow any crop, about 90% of its needs. So if you say, well, if I don't apply any, there's a good chance then that you may run into the situation where you never reach its top potential because you're shorting it for nitrogen. It will grow because 90% of it will be supplied, but it'll slow down and it will never be as good as you'd want to. So applying a little bit of nitrogen is really a wise thing to do. And a good time to apply these nitrogens would be early in the season, just as it's beginning to wake up. It's beginning, the roots are going out seeking nutrition. Good time to put on nitrogen and also sulfur. So there's a product called ammonium sulfate that's a really nice nitrogen with sulfur, and spread over your alfalfa field, particularly established ones, and then get your crop off to a good start in the spring, and that'll carry you through 3 or 4, in our area, 3 or 4 cuttings. If you're making 2 cuttings, you might only have to do 1 application, but a lot of times I like to say it takes a couple of applications throughout the season, that between after a 3rd or 4th cutting or something like that. In my particular area around here, and pretty much most all down the Central Valley and into the deserts, we're going to get 7 cuttings alfalfa, and sometimes, like I said, up to 10. So if you go about halfway through, you get your first one, halfway through, put your second one on, and that'll take you all the way through the rest of the year. Alfalfa is an extremely heavy user of nutrition, and just nitrogen alone, although it's supplying most of this, depending on how many cuttings you make, it'll take 250 to 1,000 pounds of nitrogen per year to grow these big volumes. And that 1,000 is more on one that you're producing 10 to 12 ton of alfalfa hay per year. Would be up in that area. Other things, your 250 would be more like a 2.5 to 3 ton type of yield. And I'll talk about why the yields are so variable.
Now Bill's going to switch nutrients and start talking about some phosphate.
The other thing it uses a lot of is phosphate. And phosphate is really necessary in a lot of my former talks, I've talked about how important phosphate is and the plant processes that go through that need phosphate. Well, alfalfa, because it's rapidly growing and regenerating growth all the time, it needs to keep the roots active. It needs to keep those roots going deep so it can suffer through suffer through long periods of dry weather and help it. So normally you're going to use at least 60 pounds, but the bigger the yields, the more that may push up towards 100 pounds for these large yields. And again, the first place you want to start is, where's my soil sample say my phosphate levels is? Am I excessive in phosphate? And this is a good chance to move some down, because most alfalfa stands in the varieties we use these days in the heavily farmed areas. And what I mean by that is someplace you're getting 6 to 10 cuttings a year, because you're turning it over rapidly. You're going out and you're getting your hay equipment across that ground numerous times, and this has a detrimental effect on it, but it also, you're pushing it, and I'll talk a little bit later about why that shortens the lifespan. Because I've seen good alfalfa fields in colder temperatures be out at 10, 12 years and still be producing good quality alfalfa, but you're not cutting it near as much and not having to harvest it so many times throughout the year. The other thing is so if you'll apply that phosphate at least one time a year, if you need it. If you are excessive, it's a good time to get some of your phosphate down so that you're not going to keep adding to that excessive phosphate level. That will take care of you. But if you put one on, if you are short, somewhere 50 to 100 pounds, depending on how intensive your cutting is, that will usually take you through.
Now Bill's going to talk about potassium as it relates to alfalfa.
Next is potassium. And I will say that it is a hog on potassium. It will take up potassium at luxury levels. It doesn't even need the potassium, but it loves to pull it up. And it helps with a lot of the quality, but it can actually oversupply potassium to the dairy cattle that you may be feeding it to. So there's a point where we need to know our levels. We need to know the bank, and what I mean by that is how much can I store on my soil colloid. I can't store much on a light sandy soil, but I can store a lot on a heavier clay. So that being the case, I'm going to be looking at somewhere about 50 pounds of potassium for every ton of hay that you pull off. So if you look at a product like a sulfate of potash, which is a 50% potassium product, you need to put 100 pounds of potassium for every ton of hay you pull off. Well, think about that. If you had a 10-ton yield and you're taking off 100 pounds SOP, you would have to apply to keep up with it somewhere around 1,000 pounds potassium, which is expensive. It's a half a ton. That's a lot of expense to grow alfalfa with that. But you don't want, again, over apply. If you have lots of good amounts in your soil, you can then supplement it, and you're probably putting somewhere around, I would say, at least 400 to 500 pounds of SOP per year. That would be kind of a minimum dose. I'd rather see you, if you got it and can get the yields out of it, be applying it somewhere around 2 or 3 times a year, and that would get you enough to get you through to the end of the year. It's not unusual in this area to get 8 to 10 ton, and some places down in the deserts up towards 12 ton. So you can see, if you don't have enough potassium, you're going to have a hard time getting that up to the quality levels that you want. But be careful, because you can overdo it. And I've seen things where that potassium is actually too high in some of this dairy hay, and you have to be careful with it.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about sulfur.
In addition to the nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium, as always, the one thing that we like to look at, and I've always been a stickler in almost every crop you hear me talk about, One of the things is the deficiency of sulfur. You irrigate many times, usually between every cutting. So if I'm cutting it classically 7 or 8 times a year, I'm irrigating it 7 or 8 times a year. And whether it's with a pivot, center pivot, or whether it's with a flood irrigation or berry drip or whatever, you are irrigating it a lot and it leaches sulfur. So we need to have a supply of sulfur going through there. So I talked earlier about maybe beginning your season off with ammonium sulfate, and then you're putting on sulfate of potash. Those added applications can then add up to enough sulfur to keep you going good. It helps palatability. It helps almost on any crop that formations of sugar. If you do a good job, those formations of that sugar can help you basically work on some of the insects that are prevalent. Egyptian alfalfa weevil in our area. If you can get a very good level of sugar into your plant, it'll help suppress them because they're not able to digest that sugar. And they don't have the ability to metabolize it, and so they'll either get off of it or it'll actually literally kill and knock down the populations. So sulfur really important in formations of sugar and creating good palatability. Because if you're feeding it to livestock, one of the first things, it doesn't do much good if they won't eat it. So you got to get them to the food bunk, and so for really good alfalfa, they will come to it and consume it. Whether you're mixing it in your total mixed rations or whether you're just putting it out with flakes, however you want to put it out to them, you want them to come for it as soon as it hits the feed bunk.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about his beloved micronutrients, specifically boron and cobalt.
Micronutrients are always important, but the two I'll focus most on is boron and cobalt. And I'll start, even though it's not as needed in as big amount, but cobalt is essential for nitrogen fixation. You've already heard me talking about that nitrogen fixing bacteria and how it's necessary for this so that as a legume it can fix nitrogen, etc. Well, it needs cobalt to be successful. And how much do you need? Not a lot. It's a very micro, as I like to say, micro nutrient, meaning it doesn't need very much. But it needs to be somewhere in at least 1 part per million, which would be the equivalent to 2 pounds per acre, up to 2 parts per million, or 4 pounds per acre. And these can be, if you do a good soil sample that takes a cobalt test and you find that you're at 2, between 1.5 to 2, you probably won't ever see where you're going to have to apply cobalt. But if you're down at 1/2 or less, you'll find that your alfalfa is not doing as well. A lot of times it can be a simple application of some dry cobalt. There's a couple products you can use and basically mix it in with one of your fertilizer applications, get it out, spray it out. There's multiple ways. Put it through your irrigation system, and you can do foliar, which also helps. So all of these things are fairly easy because, again, it does not take much to make a huge difference. Also, that other micronutrient I wanted to talk about was boron. And one of the reasons we need boron is we talk about the number of times that water is applied, or it's rainfall, or it's your winter, or you've got months where your alfalfa is under snow, and then as that snow melts and moves through, you leach out boron, because boron is a neutral nutrient, meaning it's not attached to the soil colloid. It's not really positive or negative, but it is neutral, so it leaches, maybe not as fast as an anion or a negatively charged particle, but it will basically move through. And so we need to, after a winter, guess what? We need to start with one of our first applications to get a boron application out there. And then as you come back a little bit later, boron's really easy to use. There's some really good product like a boric acid or a borosol, as they like to call it. Some of the trade names are out there, which is basically gives you about, for every, you can look at it, it's it will give you enough so that you can put on the proper amount of boron. Boron's always one of those that a little's good if you need it, and a lot is bad if you don't. And so check your water sources, check your boron levels. You may be adding it back in with your water. So you take all considerations before you start to apply. But once you know you've got a certain amount of water, boron in your water, you would want to come back and say, okay, I don't need to add boron. I'm the other way. I want to make sure we keep boron moving through because I keep adding to it. But if you don't, then you're going to leach it out. And with that in mind, you'd like to keep your level in the soil somewhere between 1.5 and 2 parts per million, which is roughly between 3 and 4 pounds per acre. And that's not a lot, and it doesn't need to be much. But what it does is, and we'll talk about this because I think this is one of the key parts to alfalfa, is the cutting mechanism that you do multiple times throughout the year. And boron will take, starch from the leaves and put it into the grain or the seed coming. So you're constantly putting on, the place where these alfalfa plants want to flower, but you keep putting those heads, pushing them out, trying to put them into reproductive phase, and then you immediately cut them, because one of the things is you want to cut those before they flower, because once they flower, the quality of your forage is not nearly as good. It's not near as high testing as it is if you can get that alfalfa to the point where it's just pushing those buds but not flowering out yet. And so that's where you keep drawing boron. It wants to push that and make it, flower. And so we're moving that way, and then all of a sudden you cut it, you shock it, and now you go back to starting over again. And if you think about that, you cut that at, like I say, minimum a couple times a year, but a lot of times it's 8 to 10 times. So you're growing it up and you cut it off. You grow it up and cut it off. And what you're doing is you're pulling from the stores of the roots. You're taking from those nutrients that are being taken into that alfalfa plant, and you continue to run them right through there before it ever wants to mature. So you are confusing it. It's one of the reasons that when you are growing alfalfa and you get into the super hot temperatures, you've taken off 3 or 4 cuttings, and over time you begin to weaken the roots because it's pulling them in and you're pulling them off faster than it can resupply. So most of the time here in the valley, we let it flower or go pretty much to flower at least one of these hot months. And it allows those roots to come in and restore and build up, and then we go back to the normal cutting and cutting it pre-bloom. And but sometimes once and sometimes twice. You can use that feed on either your lower producing milk cows or you're into your dry stock, etc. It's a good place to put that because it's got too much energy, or doesn't have enough energy, I should say, for the high producing milk cows, but will have enough for the lower producing, and at the same time won't be putting any fat on them because they're not producing as much milk, so they're not going into their calving season, overweight. So boron, as I said, comes in many forms. If you take a granulobor, which is a granular form of boron, and it's about 15%, somewhere around there. You can have solubor, but I'm going to talk about the granular form because you can mix it in with your other ones. And that granulobor at 15%, if you put on 15 pounds, that's a little over, it's about 2.25 pounds of actual boron. Be careful when somebody says you need to put on 15 pounds of granulobor, you don't put on 15 pounds of actual boron because you'll be way, way over the mark and have drastic results. So always know I want 2 pounds because that will raise my soil 1 part per million if I put on 2 pounds of active boron. So that's what you want to go back to. How much actual boron do I put on? Because that is what you really have to keep in balance. I want to be between 1.5 and 2. And I know that I'm going to take off between irrigation and what the plant takes up somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 pounds per year. So that's about half of the maximum amount you want. So that's why we want to keep in there. Closer you can keep that into a nice range of 1.5 to 2 parts per million of boron in your soil, that will supply you enough boron, soluble boron, into your plant and do all the functions that it needs to do. So it's a good target to go for. Again, pay close attention to your water and make sure you're not over applying.
Now Bill's going to address the cutting of alfalfa.
The next thing about cutting, I said some only people cut it 2 times. You could be in a high desert, lots of cold temperatures, lots of snowfall. So we get into what we call the dormancy of alfalfa, which means we don't want it to wake up and start to grow in the spring. We want to get almost to summer when we've gotten rid of that and our temperatures have warmed up. And so the dormancies range usually from 1 to 11, 1 being the most dormant, meaning you're only going to be able to cut it 1 or 2 times a year. In the perfect conditions, you might get 2 good cuttings and then you've got a clip, where in other words, you'll get a partial cutting, but you want to go ahead and take it off, so you're getting about 2.5 cuttings a year. And you're going to probably be somewhere around 3 ton of actual alfalfa hay. The higher the dormancy, the sooner it comes out in the season, meaning it'll come out in the spring and start to grow earlier. And so that also means usually you don't have quite the quality. So if you're trying to grow good alfalfa, hey, you for the most part in normal climates, and I mean not a lot of rain, not a lot of snow, very little, and nice warm summer temperatures, you want to be somewhere between a 5 and a 9, and probably, and when I say dormancies, you will get that on the type of alfalfa you got. That may be a really good alfalfa, but it doesn't fit your climate. We'll get back to where climate becomes instrumental in what it is that I want to do or not do with the certain type. It may be a really good quality, but it only produces 4 or 5 ton to the acre because it comes out late, it doesn't grow as fast, and then it goes dormant earlier. So if we need volume, that's why you may want to, in this climate, a lot of people will plant where they could plant 10s, they're only planting a dormancy of 10, they're only planting maybe a 7 or an 8 because it'll give them a slower growing, better quality forage, and they're feeding it to dairy cows, so that's very, very important, and so that's what we do. And the lower the dormancy, the more hardy it is. So if you have I don't see many ones, but a 2 or 3 planted, it's very winter hardy. It can withstand those real tough cold temperatures, and it'll shut off in the fall real early. And because it's cold tolerant and you're not cutting it near as often, it is not unusual to see once those alfalfa stand has been achieved, they'll go for several years, 8, 10 years in a lot of cases, and still be very productive. Whereas most everything in these warmer climates that are fairly mild winters with mild spring and growing actively for 6, 7 months or more, you're going to use, like I say, those higher ones, but they don't last as long because you're cutting them, and it's very, very difficult to manage them to get them out. Most of the time we're looking at 4 to 5 in length, and it's because of the frequency of cutting those all the time. Also, when you're cutting them like that, you're running equipment across the floor, that creating compaction. And it's very important that you're not going to be able to go in there and actually work it up, so that compaction is going to stay there throughout the growing cycle and the growing seasons that you go through. So you're looking at, on less dormant, 4 to 5 years. On a more dormant, maybe 8 to 10. But you'll grow really good quality in that cold hardy, but you're only going to be growing somewhere around 3, maybe up to 4 ton of good alfalfa. down here in the valley, we'll do 8 ton of really good quality, maybe up to 10 with a little less quality. And down in the deserts where it never quits growing, you'll get up towards 12 ton, and most of it will be not of dairy quality in a lot of cases. So it gives you a lot of that. So also with the number of cuttings and the number of times that in different varieties that come in and out of the market, you'll have what I call disease resistance that plant breeders breed for. And there's a lot of different varieties and different companies, and they've all got their product that they want to sell you. And so as a grower, you want to know, well, what's the dormancy? And over experience, normally I tell you, I like to plant a 7, or I like to plant an 8, or I like to plant a 4, a 5, or a 6, depending on where you're located. But the disease resistance, they work on plant breeding to give you these resistance to all the difference. And there's tons of different root diseases, and also foliar diseases, and then also insect tolerance and nematode tolerance in those. And when we look at, there's root knot, there's dagger, there's different nematodes that attack. And one of the reasons they attack is that this is undisturbed field and allows populations to build up. And if it gets real wet, it drives nematodes to the surface during the wintertime when it's dormant, and they find the roots and continue to feed on them. And as the water goes away, you've got some damage done if you're not careful. So we're looking something that's going to be resistant to these diseases. And the way that they're rated is that you'll see a lot on the bag is an HR. It's got, here's the diseases and here's how it ranks. And you look at all the different diseases, knowing the ones that you have the most trouble with. And then you want something that's is what's called an HR, which means highly resistant. And they even now have one that's called the HR plus, which means it's more resistance than even what we call high resistance. What a high resistance means is it's been planted in plots, it's been infected, or it's been applied the disease into that plot, and at least 50% of the plants survived. That makes it highly resistant. A highly resistant plus is even higher than that, and it could be very, very resistant. So depending on how big an issue that is, the extra money they probably want for some of these varieties is more than pays for it, because this is a 4 to 5 year crop, and in some cases you're looking at 8 or 10 year crop. So you want to put the money into that seed that you need to give you that longevity. After you get off an HR or highly resistant, you get down to resistant, which then is less percentage that survive. Then you got moderate resistant, even less. And then there's one that they just call S, which is susceptible. And if that's the case, and if you have that disease, there's no use planting it, because you will have a poor stand. You'll have all the work and effort and expense into planting a hayfield, and then it gets taken out by a nematode or another type of disease, Pythium or anthracnose. Several different things it can come up with. There's also some newer things that they're coming out with, which they call it tolerant or moderately tolerant. So most of these are in relationship not to soil programs or problems, but for insect tolerance. So tolerant would mean the insects has little or no effect. A moderately tolerant means it won't have as good a survival, but it has some tolerance to that insect. So those are things to all look at. What are your specifics for your hayfield? What are the problems that you have? And then matching up the things that I can get with these seeds that are going to help me be more successful. So the other thing that's really interesting, if you're farming this yourself, you'll always see that the crop that you plant afterwards, we've seen a lot of dairies in our area here in California where they'll plant a corn crop behind an alfalfa. The alfalfa was the last year they worked it under, went in and planted a corn crop. It's the best corn crop that they will receive probably until they plant alfalfa again. And the reason being is that that excess nitrogen that's stored in those nodules, if you look at it this way, it's like nitrogen on demand. I mean, we're applying nitrogen to our corn crops because they're heavy users of nitrogen, and yet we're putting it on and irrigating, and we're putting on another irrigation, we're putting on some more. If you're not applying what the plant needs, and I don't think anybody really ever knows exactly how much we're using at any one time, the nodule's like an on-demand, which means I put on 20 pounds, 30 pounds of nitrogen, and I needed 35 or I needed 40. Well, it'll just tap into the nodules and get the rest of it that it needs. And then if you've got enough, it seems to leave those nodules alone, but it's like it's always there for it to use, and most of that will be taken up during the life of that corn crop, and it won't have a lot of carryover for the next year. So it's really a lot of people, when they're leasing ground from somebody else and put alfalfa, if the alfalfa is going to last for 5 years, they want to have a lease for 6 years, so they get that first year because they just know the value of it. They've seen it over the years. It's kind of a phenomenon that really tells us that nature or the plants are probably better at understanding how to get and supply nitrogen than we are. Even though we continually try to get better at our nitrogen applications, it shows you we still have a ways to go to get as good as we can get. So, several things I talked about on this particular podcast about alfalfa. It's a very valuable crop, very necessary for all the dairy industry. You know, it's used throughout a lot of livestock. It's a legume. It fixes nitrogen. It has a unique problem because of the multiple times we cut it. It's a high user of nutrients, and particularly a couple specific of minor use, but still very, very essential: boron and cobalt. It has multiple dormancies to tell when it's growing in cold climates or warm climates. Different ones just by numbers. Very dormant 1, very non-dormant 11. The different varieties, the disease resistance, a lot to consider planting alfalfa, and we continue to get good changes and good uses of new disease-resistant varieties, and we continue to get better and better at what we've done. So it's a very, very interesting crop to grow, and one that can produce a lot of forage and a lot of valuable forage in a year's time. So that's all I'll say about alfalfa for today. Thanks for listening, and stay curious.
Thanks for another absolutely fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure that everyone absolutely loved what you had to say about alfalfa and the many different facets that it has. Always make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and stay curious.